Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi
Hi,
again.
Samuel.
Hi. Can I see your faces for 1 sec, or you are too messy?
Hello.
Samuel. Hi, guys. Hello. All right. There's Maha too. Hi, Maha. And Jennifer and me. I wonder if Jennifer has a camera because I haven't seen you for a while.
Oh, it's just that I just woke up, so.
Okay, no worries. Don't need to show. And with JP, there is also the, who's with you? Declan, is it? No. Jamie, you're with Jamie, that's right. Okay. Okay. Oh, hello, Alan. Okay, let's start first by asking if you got a chance to finish the homework. I received some of yours. I have 6 received by email. If you haven't done so please check your emails because there's an email that I was supposed to send last week and something happened with the computer that delayed and now you have it with you. You can check it out. Please work on it's a calculation of GDP, nominal GDP, and then the rate of growth between years, and also the rate of inflation. So I would appreciate if you take some time, if you want even to use the weekend. I would rather ask you to take your time rather than do it because you need to submit it today, because I want you to learn. So if you haven't had time to work on it, please work it, but work on it during the weekend, okay? Not later than the weekend, if you can send it back to me. So these type of calculations are important, not only to understand how to calculate the economic growth, etc., but also you will be, actually, if you are taking higher level, you're gonna be asked, this is the type of paper 3 questions that you're gonna be asked to calculate. So this is a typical paper 3 type of question. I have seen a lot this type of calculation being asked. For example, calculate the rate of growth, or calculate the inflation rate, calculate the CPI, for example. And so the more you practice, the better. Now, also, I hope that by doing this, it helps us to understand the concept, because now we should be able to understand more, okay, what do I read when I'm reading the rate of growth of a country? Now, if I know how to calculate it and I know all what is involved in the calculation, now I can see, okay, when I see the economic growth taking place, when we talk about real growth, now I know what are these numbers measuring. And you can actually criticize when you read a newspaper, as we were discussing the other day, and maybe they are just focusing on the nominal rate of growth. So if you are more inquisitive and you start to research and that was not really true because inflation has been happening, then you can send a letter to the editors and then say, well, you know, whatever they have been publishing hasn't been true or was not true. Later on next year, because we don't have the chance and the time to do it this year, we are going to talk deeper about inflation. For example, what's happening in Venezuela. Okay, Venezuela is a case in which it's gotten out of control. So again, maybe Giovanni will tell us a little bit more when you come back from the summer, how that is actually affecting the people in Venezuela, because it's about millions % that the CPI is changing from one day to the other one, if I'm not wrong. Is that right, Giovanni?
Yeah, it's right. It's 1,000,000%.
Yeah. So can you imagine the CPI changing 1,000,000%? So actually the money that you have today, just by holding it in your hand, is losing value. Every second is losing value, because then you're going to be using it and then the money has a different value. So that is something that you don't want to happen, that you don't want that to happen in a country. So that's why inflation targeting is one of the main goals of the government, trying to maintain a stable level of inflation, not more than between 3 and 4%. In industrialized countries, 2% is a healthy rate of inflation. In non-industrialized countries, we still think about 4% as a healthy rate of inflation. Okay. Any questions about the homework that you may want to address right now? We can use 5 minutes to address them.
Yeah, mine is just like, are we supposed to send it to you now, the homework?
Yes, please. If you
Yeah.
have it, yes, if you can send it by email now, that we'll appreciate that. Some of you did it by hand, so I just saw a lot of pictures being taken from your phones. That's fine, okay? As long as we see the results, and if you have questions, please ask.
Samuel, I got two questions. The first one is, you said that there's another way to find the inflation rate, not using the GDP deflator, but the change in prices. How do you do that?
Sure. Okay, so the basic concept of inflation is the change in prices over time. And actually, when we mention inflation, it's actually the increase of prices over time. We can have something that is called deflation, which is the opposite. Prices are falling down over time. And we have another one, which is called disinflation, which means the prices are changing or are increasing over time, but each year that increase is slower. So instead of changing next year 10%, then the next year is 8%, and maybe the next year is 2%. So the prices are still increasing, but at a slower rate. That's called disinflation. So your question is how to calculate then the inflation if we don't calculate the GDP deflator. So you can just add up the prices of each year. So let's say you have the total prices of cars and the total prices of TVs. If you add up that number, then you have a new big number. Okay, that's the total prices of everything. In this example was simple because it was only two goods. If you have the total prices of every good that the country is selling, then you have a big amount of prices, okay? So that amount of prices, if you compare over time, if you have the same prices and the same prices and the same prices over time, in this case, TV and cars, then you can adopt again the same thing on the next year, the same thing on the next year, and then you just calculate the rate of change of those adding of prices. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Kind of?
but like, would you do it because we consume different quantities of each good?
That's correct. That's totally correct. If you calculate, that's why when we use the CPI, we want to calculate the weight of how much these goods are being consumed compared to other goods that have not been consumed. When we talk about the CPI, remember I was telling you, well, people consume more maybe Asian food in Vancouver because the Asian population is bigger than in Toronto, for example, or than in Ontario. So then you want to compare the proportion of the consumption times the price of each region of the country, okay? Now, if you do that, it would be a more accurate rate of change of prices because you're weighting it to the amount of the goods being produced. What you are doing is actually calculating the nominal GDP that you just did. So if you calculate the nominal GDP, it's just the amount produced times the price, the amount produced times the price, and then you have the nominal GDP in this simple example. Now, because things are more complicated in real life, because can you imagine calculating everything that people consume in a country and all the prices of all the goods? That will take maybe forever to just calculate 1 year, and then it will take you more time just to calculate it than the year that you want to analyze. So what countries do, or what central banks do, they use the CPI, okay? So in this particular example, I was saying, well, instead of calculating the GDP deflator, you just calculate the prices and the prices and the prices, and you will see that the rate of change of those prices over time are very similar than if you use the GDP deflator. You use the 5% of inflation. That's what you see. The discrepancies are more in terms of the decimal numbers, okay? So, of course, those discrepancies are, of course, important, but are not as important in this example to take, because we're saying we want to calculate if the prices change it upwards by 5%.
But would you still do it with the prices, but like all value minus new value over all value?
Yes, that's what you are calculating in terms of the rate of change. That's correct. Any other questions, guys? Okay, so
I have another one.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan, please.
Why, like I write down here, why do you take into account the depreciation when when you say that GDP is about the final goods, why are you taking into account the depreciation of goods that you bought like 10 years ago or so?
Okay, good. That was a question that someone also mentioned by email that was asking me. So the question is, why do we want to discount the depreciation from the GDP? That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
So the GDP takes into consideration everything new that you are producing each year. That's clear, isn't it? We're saying the new products that have been created each year. That includes the new machinery, for example. See? Okay, so from the GDP, so why is the GDP useful? That's another question that maybe you want to ask before answering your question. Why is the GDP useful? Why do you need to know, or why do you want to know the GDP of a country? Anyone who wants to answer, why is it useful to know the GDP of a country?
To see if you're producing more or less than the previous years.
Okay, that's one reason, to see if the country is producing more or less over time. What if you are not comparing over time and you just want to see the GDP in one particular year? Why is that important?
I'm not sure, but like to measure the wealth of a country?
Yeah, that's also correct. We want to see how rich we are in monetary terms in a particular year. We may say, well, this year we are producing $30 million. Okay, that's how rich we are, isn't it? That's an information that could be used to compare between countries, or we can use it to compare over time, as Maja was saying, or we can just say, well, maybe we have a potential to produce more than $3 million. And if we can produce more, then we want to increase our productivity. So all of that those are the decisions that usually we take in macroeconomics in terms of trying to enhance the ability to produce more in an economy if we can produce more. And of course, if we want to produce more, because maybe people say, we're okay with what we have, but that's not what the Homo economicus principle or assumption tells us. As Homo economicus, we want always to have more and more because we want to maximize our benefits as we are growing. But anyways, let's go to the idea. If we know how much is produced each year in gross terms, as the GDP tells us, gross domestic product, this idea of gross is taking into consideration, or let's say, is not taking into consideration that the machinery and the buildings that are used to produce goods depreciate, okay? So think about the hotel in your home. So the hotel that you use, the beds that are used and the kitchen that is used, eventually is gonna be deteriorated, isn't it? And the buildings actually are gonna be deteriorated. If you think that they are going to be new every year, that's a lie, that's not true, okay? So let's say if you want to know, I want to sell my hotel, okay? I want to sell it to someone else. I want to tell them how much my hotel is worth, okay? That's the idea of the GDP of a country. I want to know how much my country is worth because this is what we produce in a year. Now, if your hotel today was very old, then you cannot tell someone that you are selling that your hotel is worth $1 million because $1 million is what you produce let's say every year. But if you subtract what is needed to, let's say, to renovate the rooms and to renovate the kitchen and to renovate the beds, then that $1 million is going to be reduced, okay? So that's the real value of your hotel. The gross value of the hotel will be what you are producing in time without taking into consideration the deterioration of the hotel. But if you reduce the deterioration, then the real value is gonna be less. That is called the net value of anything, okay? So that's why we say the net national income or the net domestic product or the net national product is taking away the deterioration of everything that is in a country, or in other words, the depreciation of capital versus the gross domestic product. So always is going to be lower because deterioration is always going to be subtracted from the gross value, okay?
Okay, but if the hotel that you're talking about, if my hotel was built 3 years ago and then I want to know the GDP about this year, will you take into account that depreciation?
No, the GDP does not take the depreciation. That's why we say from GDP, we want to subtract the depreciation to go to the net. Okay, so the GDP does not.
But will the net take into account that depreciation of a product that was 3 years ago?
Yes, we say the product itself, let's say the bananas are not depreciating. The banana is a final good, but in order to produce the bananas, the machinery that you used, they have depreciated. Okay, so you have to subtract it. Every year you subtract, and actually if you ask the accountant of anyone, and I'm not talking only to Alan, but those who study accountants, then you have to subtract every year a certain proportion of the capital goods as for depreciation. And usually, you know, as I was telling you the other day, usually the government is the one that sets how long a capital good may last. For example, a car may last for 10 years. So you have to depreciate each year 20% of the car. Sorry, 10% of the car, 10% of the car. So the next year, my car is valued 10% less, the next year, 20% less, etc. Actually, we use that for calculating taxes as well. The government will tax me my car every year as the year car is depreciating. That's another thing to think about. Yamaha.
Yeah, Samuel, I'm sorry. I'm just like confused because like
Okay, thank you.
We produce a car like in the year, then the GDP of the other years, like you say each year we have to depreciate, but the GDP is not going to take into consideration the car. I don't know if it makes sense because it was produced in the first place. Let's say it was produced in 2000. So the GDP in 2000 is going to take into consideration the car. But 2001, 2002, 2003, the car is not produced anymore, right? It's like you're not taking it into consideration into the GDP. So why you're going to depreciate it if it's not in the GDP anyways? I don't know.
Good. No, maybe just to clear the confusion, because using a car as an example is not the best example in the context of GDP. Because we're talking about the depreciation of capital goods, not consumption goods. A car, for your parents or me or anyone, a car is a consumption good. But if we look at a truck is a capital good because the truck is being used to produce other goods and services. So to put an example on your question, the truck that was produced, let's say last year, it was counted on the GDP of last year, okay? Now that becomes now a capital good of that country, but it was counted on the GDP because it was a new truck. Now this year, that truck is not counted anymore because it's now being sold last year, but that truck starts to deteriorate or depreciate. So if we want to look at the net national product of this year, you have to subtract the depreciation of that truck. Sounds good?
Okay, I understand, thank you.
Sure, okay. And again, maybe we don't want to complicate a lot in saying, well, then I want to go to deeper, go to the net, because what we need to understand is how we go from GDP to GMP to NNP, okay, or NNY. The calculations is mostly what the IB is going to be asking you what to do. But again, the concept is what we have been talking about. Actually, in normal literature, if you're not studying economics, if you don't want to dedicate your life to studying economics, this is what you need to know. Now, if you want to study economics further, then you will go further in how to make these calculations even more accurate, but that's something that is beyond the IB, okay? Any other questions in general? And otherwise, I will move on. Okay, so I have sent you, or I think I sent you a lecture about the GDP and the GMP, and that included a little bit the homework that we were making. I'm gonna recreate only 10 minutes of that video so you can just see something that we missed last class. And then if you have questions about that, and after those 10 minutes, we go to the new topic, which is the business cycle. You will see that it's very interesting to understand the business cycle in the context of what's happening in the world right now, okay? So let me just go through sharing you the screen of the video. Again, it's gonna be only 10 minutes. And if you have questions, please interrupt the video, interrupt me, because then I can just stop the video at that point and answer your questions. Just gonna put the full screen maybe. Let's see. Okay, again, this was your homework. I just corrected in the email, this was a mistake of mine, and actually thank you, William, for noting it. I think it was the real growth rate, because I put a different number here in my calculator. So when I made the rate of change of real GDP, it gave me 19, but I think it's 24 the correct answer. So I just corrected in the email that I sent to you, the latest, okay? GDP over time. Let me go very quickly with this concept of stock variables and growth variables. Can you hear the volume of the video, the audio? When we're measuring the economy in terms of production or in terms of the GDP measured in monetary terms, then we have what we were saying the other day that is called a stock variable. This is not the stock market. This is just the stock variable. So we're talking about something that can be measured in absolute terms, meaning we have a certain amount of food, for example. It is being stocked in our refrigerator right now. So we have 24 cans of food, or we have 30 pairs of shoes. Anything that is being measured in absolute terms is a stock variable, okay? It's a variable that we can count. It's fixed, okay? In a particular period of time, or a particular amount in time is a fixed value. So the GDP measured in monetary terms, as we have said, is a stock value or a stock variable on a particular year, okay? So we have GDP as a stock value on a particular year. But growth is a rate of change. We say growth is a flow variable. They say the amount of cans that are being produced in per day, for example, per day. So we're talking about a flow. This is changing over time, okay? So how many cans are we producing per month, or how many money is being produced in the economy between one year and the next one, meaning how many goods and services have been produced in monetary terms. That's our GDP growth rate. So the GDP growth rate is a flow variable, okay? And a flow variable meaning we're looking at the rate of change over time. So we can have a flow variable that says 10%, so we are producing 10% more than last year, or 7%, we are producing 7% more than last year. Now what happens between these 2 years? Is the GDP decreasing? No, the GDP is still increasing. Now, it increased 10% last year, it increased 7% this year, but it's still increasing. It's still a positive flow, it's a positive rate of change. If we have something like this, a -2%, now we're looking at a negative growth. So we're talking about a contraction of the economy. So this is definitely telling us that we're producing less than last year, but here we're producing more than last year. Even if last year was producing 10%, now the thing is that we are producing in a lower rate or in a lower pace than last year, but we are still producing more, 7% more than last year. So that's how we are reading the growth rates of the GDP. So that being said, look at this graph. What do you think is this, a flow or a stock graph? Okay, who would like to answer? What do you think this graph is telling us? A flow variable or a stock variable?
I think this graph is showing a stock variable because it's million tons, which is not a rate of change or anything. It's just a value.
It's an absolute value. Very good, JP. Each year they are telling us how much we are producing each year. Okay, I'm gonna keep playing the video. So you may say, oh, look, let's look what we are measuring. And the reason I want to point this out is the way that we read the graphs is very important in economics. We need to know what are we measuring in the y-axis and in the x-axis. In this case, we're looking at millions of tons of wheat or grain produced in between these years. So each year, we have a certain amount of millions of tons produced on 1960, on 1970, etc. So we have the amount. So each point of this line is actually a stock variable, isn't it? It's a stock of wheat that we have produced each year. Now, some of you may say, well, this graph also shows you a flow. Well, it is not shown in the axis, it is not shown here, but because this is in millions of tons, this is an amount. But if we want to look at the rate of change, well, for those who like mathematics, then you can say, well, we can calculate the rate of change between 2 years, don't we? So if we have the two stock values of 1 year and the other year, then we can just say, okay, we're gonna calculate the deltas. Again, the deltas will be the rate of change between 1970 and well, in this case, we're in 1960 and 1970. So how much the rate, the grain production has changed between these 2 years, these 10 years. So we can just say, okay, we're gonna calculate again the new value minus the old value divided the old value times 100, and then we have the rate of change or the delta or the flow variable of how much more grains this economy was producing over time, okay? Now, you like calculus, you can use the first derivative of this slope. That's a different thing. We're not using calculus here. We're just looking at the rate of change in a very basic model, okay? Very basic way of change, of calculating. How about this? What can you say about this? Okay, who would like to say what this is, a flow or a stock variable chart?
I think it's a flow because it's talking about growth rates and it's giving the values in percentage.
Excellent. So this is great. And maybe you're saying, oh, this is too simple because now we know what it is. But you're going to see how tricky it is when we don't differentiate reading a graph from a flow or a stock perspective. In the next couple of minutes, we're going to talk about how the GDP growth is expressed in the graph. And as Alan was saying, this is a flow because it's a growth rate. Okay, let's move on. Flow or stock variables. Graph is actually measuring. The graph is measuring a certain rate of change, so the percentage change of whatever this is producing over time. So this is a flow variable, okay? Can we say how much are they producing in this case in California, the USA, and Roseville? Can we say how much in total? No, we cannot say that because we don't have absolute values. Okay, we don't really know. They may be producing 10 liters of whatever this is per week. This is the amount of weeks. Or they can produce maybe thousands of liters each of these amounts of week. Now we're measuring here the rate of change between these weeks or these years. Sorry, this is the rate of change between years. So between 1997 and 1996, they produced 6% more. Between 1997 and 1998, 6% more. So again, we are looking at how much more they are producing. Now here's a question for you. What happened between let's look at the year 2001. So between the year 2000 and the year 2001, what can we say that happened? Did they produce less than last year or more than last year? Well, it's still a positive rate of change, isn't it? So we're looking at, they are still producing more, but at a slower rate than last year, okay? So again, the same situation, even if we look at this going down, that means it's going down, but it's still above 0%. If it's above 0%, we're looking at rate of change that is positive, so we are producing more each year according to this flow that is positive, positive, and positive, okay? There's not in the USA, not in California, neither in Roseville, there's no year that they have produced less because that would be a negative rate of change, but that is not really reflected here in the graph. Now we have an interesting graph here that is showing us how the total production, now we're looking at the size of the economy measured in monetary terms, and this is inflation adjusted. Now we know what this means. This means now we're taking away the inflation. So the real GDP of these economies in trillions, the USA has been growing steadily over time. Again, you want to look at the rate of change each year, more or less has been about 3% each year over time. Whereas China, if you can tell, it has been growing in a very interesting way. After a certain year, they have been growing exponentially, okay? So they are actually increasing the rate of growth over time in a higher than proportional percentage rate. So they are really growing faster, okay? They were producing less than the USA in the year 2000, the year 1990, but they were actually growing and accelerating the rate of growth as years goes by until they reach the point that they are producing more than the USA. According to these projections, this is all data. They were supposed to catch up with the USA in the year 2018. Now that hasn't happened yet, but we are in between this area. So China is almost about to produce more than the USA in absolute terms. Now, we are in 2020, COVID. Now we're looking at recession happening all over the world. So maybe this is going to change. This pattern may go down and this pattern may go down. The velocity of growth that we just saw there is actually the rate of change that we were looking at. And this is the GDP of the rate of growth of the GDP of the USA. And again, we're looking at, remember, I told you the rate of growth was about, in average, how much? 3%. Actually, the delta, isn't it? This is the first derivative. This is the slope of the graph that we were looking at. We were looking here at as the blue one. So this is the rate of change in average of the GDP of the USA, about 3% per year. Now in China, we were looking at a rate of growth that has been changing, but actually all the time has been, according to this period of time, from the 80s, has been faster than the USA. So there were some years that they were changing their growth almost 14% compared to the last year, whereas the USA was changing by 3.8%, for example, compared to the last year. So now we look at not the size of the economy, but the rate of growth or the velocity or the speed, okay? Velocity of producing more. Who is producing faster? China. And the USA is producing in a steady pace. And that's what we saw in the former graph. Okay, so this is actually telling us the slope of the GDP in monetary terms. Now, what do you think, guys? Do you think that GDP measures is telling us the whole picture of an economy producing? Now you have a lot to say. You may say, well, it's not enough because we need to talk about if it's real or it's nominal. Well, if it's real GDP, now we're looking at the real production. But let's subtract the GMP, well, let's calculate the GMP. Well, GDP is not enough because we have to take away the money that is flowing out from the country as term of factor income, plus the income of factors of production that are abroad, that are repatriating their payments of their factors. Also, you can say, well, how about depreciation? If all the capital goods are depreciating, then the GDP is not telling us the big picture, but it has to be subtracting the destruction of the capital goods that over time they are destructed. So GDP is not really the best way of calculating prosperity of a country, but in economics we use it in terms of producing goods and services over time. Now let's look at this situation. What if I give you these values? Country 1, country 2, and country 3. Based on these values, which country is actually the richest or the one that produces more? If we want to look at the one that produces more, is country number 3, isn't it? Country 3 is producing $50 million, okay? Now, country 2 and country 1, they are producing the same amount. Now, what if we put, again, more data here? Let's put population, because you will see the amount of money in general is just telling us the country itself is producing a lot of money, but actually people are the ones who are producing money. You have a question, Jennifer?
No, nothing.
Okay, keep going. So if we divide the GDP produced by the population of each country, now we have a different situation. They say in country 1, the population was 5 million. So instead of producing 10 $10 million overall. If we divide it by the population, now we have the value of the GDP per capita, okay? We mention per capita to say per person, okay? Capita means head. So the GDP per capita or the GDP per person is not other thing than just dividing the total GDP by the population of the country, okay? So this is a big debate because again, you may say, well, we are just calculating the population, including everyone that is studying and is not really producing. For example, yourselves, you are actually investing. You are not producing anything right now. You are just studying. My kids, for example, they are just studying. They are minors, and they are counted into this population. So even newly born people are going to be counted here. So dividing the GDP over the population also has its flaws because also this is counting everyone in the country. And what is the other flaw? We're talking about an average, okay? And this is a simple average, okay? The simple average is just telling us everyone is earning the same amount because we're just dividing the total amount over the total population. So in average, we're earning a certain amount, assuming that everyone earns exactly the same, which you will say, well, this is not true. Some people earn more, some people earn less. Let's look at this other country. Okay, so the other country that is we see here, they're actually producing the same as country one, but they have a smaller population. So the GDP per capita here, that would be bigger per capita, per person. And how about this other country? Wow, look at this country. They were producing a lot, but now they have also a lot of people. This could be a country like China or Mexico. Even if the numbers are not the same, we can say, well, country that produces a lot, but with a lot of people, the GDP per capita is going to be distributed among all these people. So it will change the whole situation. Instead of being the richest country, the country 3, now the richest country happened to be country 2. Because dividing the GDP over population, if we were distributing evenly everything that is being produced, now in country 2, each member of that country or each citizen will receive $14.2 per year or per month or whatever we are measuring it. So compared to the other one that is 1.78 and the other one that is only $2. So this also is an important thing to think about when we compare countries. If we compare the GDP per capita, we are comparing a simple average and we're dividing the total production over the simple, over the amount of people who live in that country, and that will give us a way of comparing one country to another and to say, well, this country is richer per person than these other two countries. If we look at real growth and population growth, then we also have the per capita growth. So for example, if Denmark was growing 0.4% and the GDP was growing 2.1%, then we have a growth rate that is going to be telling us that it's negative because they are actually producing, they are producing more. It's not negative, it's positive because their population is not growing at the same rate as its GDP. So actually GDP is producing more than people who are being born in Denmark, including immigrants. Remember, Brett House was talking about how in Canada, the immigration policies are going to be a situation in which if they stop people migrating, then again the population growth will start to decline. That is a problem for the long run for economies. Now, an economy that is producing more than what the people who are there, that means that there's more money available for these people. Now, in Bolivia, we have a population growth that is bigger or is faster than Denmark. And again, their GDP is also bigger. So they still have a positive GDP growth when we talk about the population growth, or the GDP per capita growth is going to be still positive because 1. So I didn't say here that in order to calculate the per capita economic growth is just subtracting the real GDP growth minus the population growth. So if we have a 5% of GDP growth and a 3% of population growth per year, So the per capita economic growth will be 2%. 0.6 minus 4.2, they still have, we're still talking about maybe 2% more of GDP growth. Okay, I'm gonna leave it here, the video. It has a little bit of a summary of what this lesson is about, but I'm gonna leave it here so you can just check it. And let's move to today's session, unless there are some questions with what we just saw. So are there any questions?
Samuel, can you repeat how to calculate the per capita growth rates, please?
Sure, yeah. So let me just, I'm gonna make a little bit of a sketch here in this slide, but let's say if we have the GDP growth rate, again, now we know the real GDP. The real GDP is growing by 5% per year, and the population growth rate was about 3% per year, okay? Which is quite, this is quite realistic. So the real growth rate per capita will be just subtracting it, will be 2% per year, okay? So we're looking at how the economy is actually producing, taking into consideration the population rate. Now, in some countries, is the opposite. Maybe the GDP growth is 2%, but the population, yes?
I don't think that we can see what are you writing. I don't know if it's.
Oh, thank you. I was just very happy writing it, everything here, but thank you for letting me know. So if I'm gonna just mention then again, so let me see if I can see. No, you won't be able. So let's say just maybe you can take notes. Let's say the GDP of a country growth is 2%. So now we're looking that the GDP is growing by 2%. But what if the population of that country is growing by 4% that year? So what do you think is happening actually with the real GDP of that per person?
It's actually decreasing.
Is decreasing, that's correct. So we say actually the country is reproducing itself more than what they are producing in goods and services. So that means that in the long run, they are producing less and less compared to the amount of people. That's a problem for the country because they will not be able to sustain everyone at that rate, okay? And actually many countries, or not many, but some countries, they face that problem. Population growth is faster than the GDP growth, okay? Okay. So I hope that clarifies it. Let's move to the next topic, which is the business cycle. This should take us not more than 25 minutes, I think, including if there are some questions on the go, okay? So let me define the business cycle as a model or a graph that will portray or will show the fluctuations of an economy, okay? So as the slide says here, it describes the rise and fall in production over time. Sorry, yeah.
No, we can't see what we're doing in the slides. I think you have to not share and then share the slides again.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you, I'm sorry. I was just very happy showing you the, let me see here. Can you see now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, can you see the business cycle slides? Yeah. Okay. So, thank you. So the business cycle, as I was telling you, is just a model that shows how the economy is performing over time. Now, how can we identify the performance of an economy? Usually we talk about the GDP growth, okay? So how the GDP is changing over time. So the business cycle shows the fluctuations, and you will see that every country in the world will have fluctuations over time, okay? So, let's go to directly to how it looks like. So what we have here is the business cycle with its different phases, okay? So first of all, we need to look at what are we drawing in a graph like this. So in our axis, we are putting here time, okay? So over time, how the real GDP is changing over time. That's our important thing here. So this time could be in years, could be in months, could be actually in weeks, and the real GDP is going to be measured in monetary terms, okay? Now, we have different phases of the business cycle, and we will talk about those phases in 1 second. But let me show you that the business cycle has this pattern that you are looking at here, because this is what we call the fluctuations or the natural fluctuations of an economy over time. If you have questions, we can further discuss why these fluctuations take place. There are different theories behind, but what we will see is that the GDP of all countries, and if you want to Google eventually your country, you will find the business cycle of your country having something like this. So let's talk about the phases of the business cycle. We call the recovery phase when it's just coming from the trough. You see here a trough, or the lowest part of the business cycle. When the business cycle came to the trough or the bottom, it starts to recover. So we call it the recovery phase. So how can we tell if an economy is recovering? We only can tell when we look back, okay? We cannot say that the economy will recover next year because nobody can predict the future. We can make an idea of if this happens, then this other thing happens, ceteris paribus, but we cannot say that the economy will recover never. That's something that nobody can actually tell for sure. But the recovery is this part of the graph after the we may say the trough, okay? The trough, this will be the lowest part of the fluctuation. Then as time goes by, the economy keeps growing and growing. And this part that we see here, I'm just gonna move over here, this is what we call the expansion. So just look at the difference between the recovery and the expansion, is that the expansion is when the economy is very close to its top, okay? Or to its peak, okay? We say that an economy is booming when it's actually facing an expansion. We say the economy is booming. So the peak here is called the peak actually, but all this area will be called the boom area or the booming phase, when the economy is actually producing and expanding more and more over time. Now, let me just mention something very important. The business cycle is not just a straight line. If we zoom this straight line, let's say, we would be looking at small fluctuations here. So the business cycle is actually comprised of small cycles. And if we go and zoom this cycle every day, let's say if we're measuring the business cycle per month and then per week and then per day, each day we have fluctuations. And if we go to per hour, actually what this is telling us is how the markets perform every second, okay? So this could be a business cycle over seconds. Let's say if these are 60 seconds, we may say sometimes we buy more in the economy, sometimes we buy less in the economy, and then that is actually building and building and building our business cycle when we expand over time. So the other phase that we didn't talk about so far is what we call the contraction of the economy. The contraction will be from the boom to the trough. So let's say from the peak to the bottom. All these will be a contraction of the economy. What can we say is that the economy is actually producing less and less and less in absolute terms. Remember this as stock variable. We're measuring the GDP in monetary terms, in absolute terms, producing less and less and less over time. And then we reach again a point in which the economy will start to go back again up. And this is what we call it again, the expansion of the economy. And we have the recovery phase and the expansive phase of the economy in these two parts, okay? Any questions so far? Good. So we said that there are the short-term fluctuations. So the short-term fluctuations, we may say, are actually these waves that we see here. So the economy can produce a lot, then it can produce low, and then a lot. But these fluctuations, depending on the trend of these fluctuations, they will determine the long-run trend, actually, okay? So the long-run trend of the economy is determined by the short-term fluctuations. In this case, why do you think that the long-run trend has an upward slope? Anyone who wants to maybe explain why do you think this red long run is not a flat line or is a line that goes downwards but is going up? What is making the long run to go up?
I feel like the parts where there's a recession are shorter than the expansion, than the recovery and the expansion. Like it's
excellent. Perfect, excellent. And you use the correct terms by saying, yes, the expansions are actually bigger than the recessions, or we may even say steeper than the recessions in a short-term time. So this is making the long-run trend to go upwards, okay? So we say the short-term fluctuations determine the long trend of the economy. Let's put this in here, and again, this is being recorded, so if you want to pause it later, and then your task will be to name the phases here, A, B, C, and D. And again, we have the phase here, and maybe something before going to this graph, let me say something that is also important. When we look at the long run trend, what we are doing here is we're just making the line of best fit. Okay, you know that by if you're taking mathematics standard level. The line of best fit is just taking away the fluctuations, and let's say it's an average of these fluctuations over time. Sorry. So this average has a lot to do with how are we putting the time frame. The time frame could be 10 years, or the time frame could be 1 year. But that will make a big difference on this average, wouldn't it? Let's say if we're looking at the fluctuations of a country between 5 years, it's a different average than between 25 years if this country has been having some recessions in between. So the long run trend, because it's the average, we can just mention a little bit more about the recovery and the expansion phase. The recovery phase usually is below the average, okay? So below the long run trend. So when the economy is still recovering, we say it's still recovering, and then it reached the point that is our average long run economic run growth. After this point, the economy is expanding. Why? Because it's actually going beyond our average, okay? So we can refer to the expansion phase when it's above the long run trend, and actually the recovery phase when it's below the long run trend. So this part here and this part here will be still the recovery, and this part over here and this part over here will be what we call the economy is expanding, okay? So you can say here, well, this is the expansion phase. You may say, well, this could be the recovery phase on one part of this. This is the contraction phase, and this could be also the booming phase. Again, if you take 10 different books, the 10 different books will label it in 10 different ways. As long as we have the idea of expansion, contraction, boom, and drought, or yeah, we can say actually the bottom. So we have the 4 phases of the business cycle. Another thing I didn't mention here is that if the contraction is for more than 6 months, then we call it technically a recession. So that means that the economy is producing less and less and less for at least 6 months. Sometimes there are some fluctuations that will tell us, oh, the economy just produced less than the last year. No, sorry, less than the last month, but then it recovered back again, okay? So that will not be considered a recession if the economy just was producing less and less for less than 6 months. It's still not technically a recession.
Well,
go ahead, Giovanni.
Is it a recession when the GDP, we say that like is negative?
Good question. The GDP is still positive because it's just a number. Remember, maybe the GDP over here, for some reasons, I can write now. So maybe the GDP over here, it will be, let me just put numbers here. Let's say maybe the GDP here was $30 trillion, okay? That was, let's put a year here. That was in 2005 to put just a year. Then the next year, if we can just see, it's still more than 30,000. It's maybe $31 trillion, isn't it? That would be the next year. Now, let's say if this was the case, let's say that this is, let's say, 2009. Let's just use the example. But in 2009, we still have a positive number, isn't it? Maybe we have $28 trillion. So this is still a positive number because we're looking at the real GDP measured in dollars, okay? The thing is that this number is less than the other two that we were measuring or comparing here. And also is less than maybe 2008. Maybe in 2008, this economy was producing the same as in 2005, okay, the 30 trillions. But as the economy has been producing less and less, now the number is 28 trillions, and then it will be 26 trillions and 25 trillions. So it's going down, but the GDP is still expressed in positive values. What is the negative part here, Giovanni? If something is negative, we can identify what is the negative part.
Is it the growth rate?
Great, that's the growth rate. Is the difference, isn't it? The growth rate between 2008 and 2009 was negative because now the economy is producing less than the former year. And again, less than the former year. Here, let's look at this area over here. Between 2006 and 2005, the GDP was growing, so it's still a positive growth rate, isn't it? Now this growth rate is smaller than in the former year. Maybe the growth rate here was 4%, and here maybe it's 2%. So the economy was still growing, but at a smaller rate, okay? At a smaller or a slower pace. So the economy was producing more. It's not a recession yet because the economy is booming, but it's booming in a slower rate than it before. Here, the economy is in recession. Actually, it's producing negatively compared to the last year, okay? So let's move on to real data, okay? This is the USA. Now you're gonna be used to this graph because you will be ready to know, I know the USA, I know this is the USA because of what you see here in pink, okay? This area that you see here in pink, this hole that we see here that happened, that was what we call the Big Depression of 1930s, okay? So you see how the GDP was having a trend that was positive, 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 and then suddenly it dropped, okay? If we forget about the rest of the graph, so if we look at just until here, people were actually panicking because there was a recession, taking more than 6 months, taking more than 1 year. So people were actually looking at the economy is not really producing more, we're producing less. Business were closing, people were laid off, the economy was contracting and contracting more and more and more, okay? So that is what they were facing here. Now, as you can tell, this recession lasted a lot. It lasted actually for 2 years, and then it started to recover very slowly, okay? This is what Brett House was talking about, the L shape or the V shape. In this case, we have a W shape. Actually, we have a double dip, as some people call it. Double dip because the economy was starting to recover, but eventually it fell down again, okay? Let me just clean this. So you see how the economy was recovering and then it fell down again and then recovered back again. Here we have another recovery, another W shape, okay? Falling down, going back, and then falling down again. So there are theories why the economy was falling down and not able to recover in a steady pace. Like, why did the economy fall down again? We can talk about that next week, but I'm gonna just leave it here for you to see how the business cycle is actually telling us how the economy is performing, and we can identify the recessions over time. Any questions or anything that captures your attention so far?
Samuel?
Yeah.
So every time we are analyzing a business cycle, if we see that the curve goes down, we can say that is that depression, or is maybe not a depression, but it's a contraction of the economy, right?
Totally right. It's a contraction, and depending how long is this data, then we can just say technically it's a recession. Recession instead of the depression is not really the word that we use. We use more the word recession, yeah, it's more if it's more than 6 months. Okay. So sometimes, yeah, sometimes we will see. Maybe the next slide will help. What can you see over here? This is more recent. This is a business cycle of the USA since 1998. Okay. To 2000 and almost 2019, okay? So again, you see that big fall down of the economy. Again, this is what we call the big recession of 2008. Anything that captures your attention about looking at this graph compared to the one that we just saw?
other than 2008, it seems to have a lot less fluctuation.
Okay, good. That's an interesting view. Compared to that, this graph, we see more the fluctuations. I'm just trying to see, we have here a space of 10 years, every 10 years, and we have a space here every year. And even if it's every 10 years, we see more fluctuations than here. So the economy has been a little bit more stable in terms of its fluctuations. That's a good observation that I haven't noticed. What else can you say about this graph compared to this other one? Or maybe you can just mention anything that you capture the attention of this one.
The Great Depression lasted much longer.
Good. That's another thing. At least, well, we can see that this didn't recover as fast as the Great Depression in terms of going up very quickly, because this was more an L shape. Remember that Brett was mentioning here. So we have here, it fell down and then it made like an L. This is not a W again. Sometimes we may see an economy recovering very fast. So we have like this V, this goes up here and then it keeps going back up here. We have another that is called the U shape that you can imagine how it looks like again. So it depends on the time that it takes to recover back. Okay, so a U will be more something like this. Okay, and we have the L shape, which is more likely what we see here happening. Now, JP said it took less time to recover. The only thing is that this less time, if we compare here, the recovery was going back maybe until 1950, or maybe less, maybe during the 40s, the recovery came back, and then maybe this is something to add into the conversation. Look at the long-term long trend over here compared to the long trend slope over here. What can you say about these two long trend slopes?
It was growing much faster.
After the recession, didn't they? After the depression. So actually something happened in the economy of the USA that allowed them to grow faster than what was going on before the depression. Look at this. This is an interesting thing to analyze also later, because we will learn that actually what happened here during the depression made a big difference on the productivity of the economy of the USA. And just to put it very simple, what the USA did, and this is called the Keynesian policies, they invested in a lot of roads, a lot of infrastructure. They built a lot of schools during this time. That was used as a fiscal policy or a fiscal stimulus to provide jobs to people. The government spent on all of this, and once all of this was already created and the economy came back to track, it had already almost the whole, the whole economy ready for them, or the infrastructure ready for them to produce faster than what they were producing before. Here we have more educated people, we have roads, we have bridges, we have airports, many public goods that allow the economy to produce faster than what they were producing before. So that's an important also thing to think about. Here, we don't see the same thing. We see that actually the trend is almost the same, isn't it? We see actually here and here is almost the same slope. So coming back to the answer of JP, even if they are still recovering, they were recovering very slowly to come back to the trend that they were having before. So if we expand this trend, actually this economy hasn't really reached back to the former trend, just visually looking at here if we just want to simplify the analysis. But this is actually what's happening in the US economy. They haven't been able to come back to its former growth trend after the 2008 recession, okay? So there's still a gap that they need to fill if they want to go back in track as they were before. Now that is also related with many people actually being deported and they are not coming back, and many other things that happen in the economy. Plus the economy was not really investing in more roads. They already have the roads. They already have the airports. So it was not really what happened over here. Okay, any final comments before we wrap up here this concept?
It's not like, are we gonna speak about the reasons behind recession and like what actually makes an economy go into contraction, etc.?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
thank you very much. And I think I'm gonna finish with that, and then next class we're gonna take that as our beginning of the analysis, because that's when we want to analyze all the models and the policies that are going to be used. But this is our basic, let's say, startup. So let's look at this graph, okay? I'm gonna answer that question in 1 second, Maha, just to finish today. Now let's look at this graph. What is this graph telling us? Maybe someone who hasn't spoken yet, can you tell us what do you see here happening? Maria.
Hi.
Hello. What do you see here? Maybe you want to look at what the axes are telling us and what is this? This is over time. This is the USA. Read the title, and then you tell us what do you understand from this graph. Any answer is correct, because we want to see if we are learning here.
Yeah, like it was growing like to some extent constant, but then there was like the economic growth was negative in the years 2008, 2009, where like we can see the economic growth is negative, but then it started to recover in kind of following the path that it was before. So by the year 2010, 2011, like it was taking again
The trend.
yeah, the trend.
Excellent, excellent analysis, Maria. Thank you very much. We see how this is the rate of growth. Again, this is a flow variable that was telling us the economy was growing more or less in average, let's say 3%, okay? Wasn't it? Between 2 and 4%. They were growing in average about 3%, 3.5% each year until they reached the recession, okay? 2008, negative growth. 2009, big negative growth. But look at this, 2.5% less than the last year. Go ahead, there was a question. No? Now, what happened after the recovery? They went back to track, maybe a little bit less than what they were before. Now, instead of growing at 3% or 3.5%, they are growing at 3 or 2.5% in average. If we see this is actually the slope of this graph compared to the slope of this graph, okay? So this is the GDP in absolute terms. This is actually the recession, and this keeps growing. Again, this became positive again, but the positive growth was a little bit slower than what we were looking at before. So that's again the trend line that I show you that was different here than here.
Samuel?
See.
I'm wondering what, like, I see a huge difference between 2000 and 2001, like between those years. I'm wondering what happened, and I don't have any information.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, there are different reasons why the economy was growing slower here and why actually they had a recession here during the 90s, okay? So this may be helpful to answer Maha's question as well. What actually determines the flows or the fluctuations of the business cycle of an economy? So if we think about anything that is driving the supply and the demand of the economy, okay, think about anything that is making the economy more productive. Who can give me ideas of what could make the economy more productive from the supply side? How can you produce actually more over time?
Thanks to innovation.
Innovation, good. So innovation is one thing that if you keep investing in research and development and you keep investing in universities and research and instilling creativity in your people, that will make the economy to boom, okay? Because then all this innovation is creating more and more goods and services that in a creative way that are using less resources. That could be a way of one variable explaining how the economy can go up, okay? So actually a country that is not innovating over time may have this slope a little bit more flat. The economy keeps producing just what they have been producing over time, but with no innovation, then the economy will look like this, okay? Maybe like this, okay? What else could be driving the production of the economy? Let's just try to think about the production, not the productivity. So how can you produce more?
I also feel like increasing the number of capital goods like machinery, etc.
Totally right. And that's the answer. We may say, as long as we are increasing our factors of production, we may be producing more, okay? So in some countries, that is kind of what we talk about the other, you know, the solo model that was showing us how if we use more capital goods, the economy can produce actually more goods and services over time. Or if the economy is using more, it's already given factors of production. Let's think about more land being used to produce goods and services instead of just keeping the land without any use. So these are other factors that are allowing the GDP to grow if you are using more FOPs, okay? That's from the supply side, again, the productivity and the availability of factors of production. Now let's think about what if you produce a lot, but nobody's buying your stuff. So if you are producing and nobody's buying it, actually you are not really increasing your GDP. You are increasing your stocks of production, but then again, they may be disappearing if nobody buys them because they will get rotten, for example. So how can we make people to buy our goods? Give me ideas from the consumption side. From the demand side, how can you make more people to buy the goods that are being produced?
And it's really cheap.
Pardon me, can you repeat?
When it's cheap, when it's less expensive.
Okay, that's another good answer. We may think when the goods are produced at a cheaper rate, then more people will be buying those goods. Okay, that could lead at a higher consumption of goods and services. That could be one answer. What else could be driving the consumption?
If people can get money easily, like if there is good employment rate and they can get money from the bank, for example, to invest or like to consume.
Excellent. Excelente, Giovanni. So what you're saying is the more income, disposable income people have, the more they will consume. So some people may say, well, if in this economy people are not employed, they will not consume. This is the sea of consumption, okay? So if we are looking at more people employed, we were talking about more consumption, and more consumption will drive more production. Okay, so that's another reason why the GDP could also be growing, added to the other reasons that we were discussing before. From the supply side, we say availability of factors of production, technological changes, creativity, and all these things that are making the economy to be more productive. But from the consumption side, more income. So let's say if the people are now earning more money, or if there are people who are now more employed, that will increase their consumption side, so the production will increase. Any other idea that we haven't discussed? Mm-hmm.
Population growth.
Good. As long as this population, new population that is increasing, is having money, that will increase the GDP. Now, in some countries, you may say, well, there's a part of the population that is growing and they are in poverty. Actually, these people are maybe just dying and starving, so that will not grow the GDP, but it will even create a situation that yeah, well, these are humanitarian, that's not counted in the GDP. But we may say population growth, as long as these people are producing more, will increase the GDP. So think about if this country, let's make an example. If this country, hypothetically, during 2004, which is over here, if they open their boundaries and say, you know, we're gonna let 3 million or 5 million people to enter without any visa to work, what do you think will happen with the business cycle? It could go up like this, wouldn't it? Because we have now more people entering into the economy. You know, in economics, people are counted as factors of production. We call people as factors of production, as long as they produce more, okay? So all of these policies, yeah, Giovanni.
Is there any way to like, because what happened in Venezuela, for example, migrants, they are not all of them, like they haven't studied, so that means that maybe they cannot like participate in the economy as easily as other people have studied. So is there any way to measure that? Like,
yeah, definitely yes. We measure how much each individual produces versus how much you consume. So for example, you as students, you are net consumers, okay? Eventually you will be producers, but you are net consumers of everything. So if you compare that net consumption versus your production, you have a negative number already in your within yourself. Now let's see someone like me. If I produce a certain amount, but I spend more than what I earn, then I have a negative. Again, I am a net consumer. So all people usually they will be net consumers back again. People in their productive, let's say, time life is between 25 and 50 years old. Well, it depends on the country and depends on many factors. Some people say between the 16 and 65 years old, that's your adulthood, but your productivity is going to be related with how much do you spend, okay? So if people spend more than what they produce, you will see something like this. The economy is actually contracting because you're not producing as much and you are consuming yourself, your country. So you want to produce at least a little bit more than what you consume, okay? I hope that answered your question. So trying to put all of these together, there's another reason why do we have fluctuations like this, okay? One reason is the weather. Actually, even if it sounds so simplistic, it's true because a whole lot of factors of production depend on the weather. So food, and I'm talking about mostly non-industrialized economies. Actually, this is important. So if the weather is good, you can produce more goods. When there's a drought or there's floods in the country, they may be producing less goods. So countries relying a lot on agricultural production will be facing these cycles depending on the weather. But not only the weather, of course, there are some policies that are going to be affecting the production. How the other rest of the world is buying your goods has to do. Let's say if China is not buying goods from the USA, then we may find like something like this happening. Also, if goods are becoming more expensive, that will mean that people are not buying the same amount of goods. That will also contract the economy. So all of that is related with the business cycle. Something else that I was thinking, oh yeah, a war, for example, a war will create the recessions to take place as well, okay? So coming back to the question of, who was Maria, I think you were asking what happened here, what happened over here, and what happened actually, Giovanni was asking what happened over here. So in the early year 2000, there was what we call the, sorry, let me think about if this was the dot-com recession. I'm not really sure if the GDP, this is not a recession, this is actually a slowdown of the GDP, okay? This could be related with the dot-com, but no, I think the dot-com was in the 90s.
Wasn't it about the September 11 attacks?
Oh yeah, so you're right. So this is the September 11, that created a big impact on the economy, thank you. This is not really creating a recession, but actually the economy was really harmed, that's correct. Actually, international trade was harmed because of that. Thank you, Alan. Here was the dot-com bubble that exploded, that made many firms that actually were not really productive to disappear. So the GDP decreased. And if you go back in time over the 80s, we don't have any graphs so far here, there was a recession of the 80s that was more related with the prices of oil increasing, and therefore most of the oil of the world, of the Western world, was imported, and they were not having enough money to pay for the oil, so the production just contracted, because they were producing less and less. I'm just mentioning the 80s, okay? This is not this one. So reasons why we have depressions and recessions, we're gonna discuss next class, but now you can start to make things and to think about, okay, the crisis that we are facing right now is a typical crisis of what will trigger a recession. If people are not consuming because we are stranded in our houses, then the recession will take place because of the lack of consumption. If China is not selling to the rest of the world, that means that the rest of the world doesn't have raw materials or all these products. It also will create a depression on the rest of the world because we don't have the inputs to produce from China. But China is not selling, actually, to their exports are also facing a downturn, so that also creates a recession. So all of these factors that are related with the consumption or the expenditure of an economy and the production of the economy not being able to produce as much, all this together is what we're looking right now in the world. Look at this one. This is just coming right from the oven. This happened to be 3 days ago. This was released by the US government Statistics Bureau. and they were showing how in the first quarter, this is the first trimester or the first January, February, and March. Now you can read this graph with the knowledge that you have. This is the real GDP percentage change from the last quarter. So they're just saying from the last December quarter, October, November, and December, how much the economy has produced less or more compared to the last quarter. So look at this, how much actually they have been contracting. They contracted 4.8%, or the USA produced 4.8 less than the former quarter, okay? Now look at this recession. This was only 2.3% in the whole year. Some months or some quarters could have been bigger. Some months or some quarters could be lower. In average, they produced this less than the former year, 2.3% less. But now we are starting the year with a minus 4.8%. And this is not taking into consideration all the impact of in the USA that is taking place in April, which just happened, and March and April and May, which is going to be another impact. So if this keeps growing down, and we expect that to be the next data that is going to be released in June, wow, we are starting to see what, again, everybody's talking about. The recession in this year, 2020, could be bigger than the one that we saw here in the Big Depression of the USA. So we need to be looking at the numbers that are releasing every month in our countries, and mainly in the USA, because the USA is the biggest consumption of the world. Just to finish with this slide, who would like to explain what do you see here? Looking at the title of the graph, looking at the trend, and looking at what are we measuring, you should be able to tell a story about Canada between these years. Take your time, and whoever is ready to tell us a story, please jump in.
Well, we can see all the fluctuations, right? And then we can see the long-term fit, which appears to be negative, because we can see that the phases of contraction take more time than the phases of recovery. And they're also much more important, which create a fit, like a general fit line of an economy generally going down.
Okay, so far is a good analysis, but there's still an error on your analysis, because maybe my question will be, do you think that Canada is actually producing less over time or not?
I think Canada is producing, like every year they are producing is above 0%, like at least the general trend. So they are producing more, but each year or in the long run term, they are producing less and less and less and less than the previous year.
Excellent. That's a good way of looking at it. Still, we are producing in Canada, we are producing and producing more, but the velocity or the rate of producing is the one that is being decelerating. We use the word deceleration. So it's not accelerating, but decelerating. So this is a slower rate of growth, which means now the economy is producing still more and more, but now at a slower rate. And if the population, remember, if the population growth is in Canada is bigger than 2%, then we would have in the future less GDP per capita than what we have today if this is a trend ceteris paribus. Because now we see that the 2% is the average overall in the last 40 years or whatever. Well, it is a lot more than 40 years. So the economy is producing less and less over time. Someone has wanted to say something else about this?
Samuel, I have a question about it.
Yeah.
So could it also be here saying that Canada's production is increasing in a linear fashion? Because this percentage is compared to the last year. So could you say that Canada is having a constant expansion almost?
Well, let's put it in other terms. I wouldn't say that Canada is having a constant expansion, because if it was constant, this line will be a straight line at around a certain number. Okay, that will be constantly expanding at the same rate. They are expanding, but the expansion is decelerating. So we don't use the concept constant expansion, because constant is the same rate of expansion. Here we can clearly see that we in Canada are expanding at a slower rate each year, okay? Even if some years we're growing faster than others, we are growing in average slower than the long term. So think about a PPF, maybe trying to finish to answer your question. If you think about a PPF here, Canada is still, how would you draw a PPF here, Declan? Would be the PPF of Canada expanding, or they will be contracting over time?
It'll be expanding over time,
sure.
Except for in these recession years here.
Sure, except for the recession years, but in average we may say, yeah, it's expanding over time. But this gap, the expansion over time of this gap is starting to be less and less and less, okay? It's going to be smaller. So it's not a constant expansion. A constant expansion will be having this gap constant, okay?
Okay.
So this, yes,
sorry,
go ahead.
Can we speak about contraction even though it's rate of growth and not actual production of the GDP?
No, we cannot say that it's a contraction of the economy. It's a slowdown of the economy. So yes, because we're looking at rate of growth, it's a slowdown, or we may say a deceleration of the growth of the economy of Canada. The contractions, as you mentioned before, are just the ones that are below zero. So these are actually the contractions that are just 4 that we can see here that have been taking place in Canada over the last whatever time this is. But the economy is not contracting in the long run, but it's producing less, or is decelerating. Okay, we use the word deceleration.
Okay, and is there an explanation for this?
Yeah, interesting, because the explanation that they are using is one is the slowdown of the immigration. Okay, so this was taken from a paper that was arguing that the immigration policies in Canada have been tightened, and that has been making the economy to be less productive over time, which is seen in this long-run trend. They are using that as the main variable, but there may be other variables that could be related. Let's say maybe the productivity of the land is been decreasing. I wonder if the oil production has to do something here. We have some booming years of oil maybe that has the economy taking advantage. But again, maybe the fracking is not longer the one in the last 10 years. The oil on Canada is not as attractive as before. So that is making the economy to slow down compared to some other parts of the time that we see here. So those are different variables, but yeah, the main situation that was argued here was the immigration policies tightening and then less people entering to Canada, and actually the population reproduction rate of the population inside Canada is very low. People don't have children here. Good. So I'm gonna leave it here, guys, because why are we taking time to look at this? The next classes, we're gonna use this, our basis of analysis, when we go to the macroeconomic models, okay, which is this model that you see here is the one that we're gonna start using. And now we only have 2 classes remaining, but I think it's gonna be enough to just start using the model comfortable. But also, if we need an extra class, I will ask you to whoever wants to stay. If there's a consensus, we will make an extra class after the 15, just to consolidate everything related with macroeconomic models. If there is no possibility, then we will start next year with this concept again, just to finish the topic of macroeconomic, but I would rather have the momentum built here. So this is something that I will leave it here, not to make it right now. Oh yeah, we can make it right now very quickly, because look at this graph and then let's try to answer these questions. And I know Maha and some of you that are making Ramadan, you need to leave very early. If you need to leave, just leave, but let's say if we can stay 5 minutes more, that would be awesome. I won't take more than 5 minutes. Thank you. So look at this graph. We have the USA, Greece, and Chile. USA blue, Greece red, and Chile the green one. what this graph is telling us is important, is the rate of growth. Again, this is not the GDP in absolute terms, but it's the flow variable. So the first question, maybe I'm gonna ask directly to people here. So get ready. Let's see, do we still have me over there? Are you awake, me? Hello, me. Can you answer the first question with this, from these three countries, based on the data that you see here, which country has the highest GDP per capita in 2006?
Greece.
Can you say that?
Greece. I would say Greece.
You would say Greece. Who would like to agree or disagree with me that Greece has the highest GDP per capita in 2006?
I don't think I agree because it's real GDP change, right? So isn't it the US? Just out of common sense, I don't know.
Okay, and Maha is saying the USA would have. How do you know that it has the highest GDP per capita based on this graph?
I'm not even basing it on the graph because it says like real GDP change, right? So it's not the absolute value. I'm just assuming it's the US because it's the US.
Okay.
Can't we not know because it's just the rate of change? So it could be the Greece had a very small GDP per capita and then now it's increased much more than the US, but it's still less than the US or it's still less than Chile or whatever.
Great, excellent. So again, the answer will be, we don't know. This graph is not telling us how much is the GDP per capita. So if I should have written here based on this graph, because we may have general knowledge, as Maha was saying, well, the USA may have the highest one, but based on this graph, we cannot tell. So you're correct, William, as well. So even if the Greece was growing faster, we don't really know if Greece is the richest one, okay? So the answer here will be not possible, not enough data available with this graph. Okay. Now, let me ask someone else. Let's see if we can see who else. We have Jamie, we haven't heard you, and Derek, we haven't heard you. So Jamie, what would be the answer for B? Which has been the fastest growing country between 2010 and 2012, based on this graph?
I think Chile has been the fastest growing country between those years.
Good, and that's correct. We may say, yeah, in average, they have been growing, and we can clearly see that. And Derek, can you explain what happened with the total output of the USA? Just look at the USA. We're gonna ask you other people, the other two countries. So the USA in 2007, between 2007 and 2008. So we're looking at the USA over here. What happened with the GDP of the USA in 2008? Did it expand, did it contract, or did it stay the same?
To me, it looked like it contracted a bit, or between 2007 and 2008.
Okay. Keep going.
Let's see. Yeah.
Let's look at Chile. Do you think that Chile expanded or contracted in 2008 compared to 2007?
Sorry, I just can't really. Sorry, I'm just really tired.
Okay, no worries. Okay, and let's see if we can see who else do we have here. I think we have heard almost everyone. Let's see. Jennifer, if you're still there, would you answer what happened with do you think that Chile in 2008 contracted or expanded compared to 2007?
I think it still grew a bit. Because the change is still positive.
Excellent. So that's what we're looking at. I wanted to confuse you using these graphs because you're looking at, oh, what happened here between these 2 years? It looks like it went down, but actually it didn't went down. Actually, it increased. The number that we want to look is that this 3.8% more or less, more than the last year. So they are growing at a slower pace than the last year, but they are still expanding, okay? So they are growing more. Here, They are still growing more. No, this is negative growth. So this is where they're having a contraction. Okay, so now we have these, I think, wrapping up. We have this clear. I want to send you right now, I'm gonna send, you're gonna receive by email an email with a short quiz that has no points in terms of your average grade. Is not gonna actually influence any of your marks, but it's for you to practice what we just did today. Okay, so I'm just gonna send it right now. If you have time right now, go for it. Otherwise, try to work on it during the weekend. And there's also a reading that I want you to read, which is related with the three main schools of economic thought. One is the Marxist, the other one is the neoclassical, and the other one is the Keynesian. So this is when economics starts to become pretty interesting for those who like philosophy and for those who like actually politics, because this is related to how the world has adopted certain ideologies based on these three economists: Adam Smith, John Maynard Keynes, and Karl Marx. Okay, the reading that I'm sending to you is just a one-page reading. It's nothing. It's just a little paragraph that differentiates one to the other schools of thought. But I'm sending you some links of the real books that they wrote. I'm not expecting you to read all of that because it's a lot of reading and it's very technical and it's boring. But if you're really curious, and I know some of you are, then you have the resources to do something during the summer if you want to read a little bit more deeper. Okay? Great. So let me finish and wrap up today by asking you if you have any final question about these topics.
Samuel, I don't have a question about the topic, but I have other questions.
Sure.
About talking about the grades, how are we gonna be graded this term?
Yeah.
You respond that already, but I don't remember. So.
Yeah, so your grades so far have been graded by the examinations that we have done so far here in the campus, okay? So you already have your grades, your achieved grades based on what we did. Now, I'm gonna make a little short online examination at the end of the term, just for you to have an assessment to see how much did you learn, and to also to assess this online new idea. That is not going to be counted in terms of your predicted grades, but I'm gonna send you that, that marking, so you will see how did you perform just for the topics of these last 3 or 4 weeks, let's say the 2 months more or less, okay, since you left the campus, okay? Now, that's gonna be a final assessment. Is the same system that we're using today. I will send you by email. That will be the last day of classes, okay? It shouldn't take you more than 1 hour to do that. It's multiple choice questions. So you don't expect any more IB questions this term. You have already your achieved grades. The only thing that I'm pending is to provide you feedback from your IAs, okay? I need to work on those. I'm gonna be working on those on the following weeks now that we're done with the second years. And I will send you the IAs to work on during the summer, okay? Now those IAs are gonna be to be submitted when you start back as a second year, so you don't have to submit them right now, but in August, late August or September, okay? That's how it is in general, okay, Giovanni?
Okay, gracias.
Bueno, okay, guys, so take care of yourselves, and for those who wrote in the morning that you wanted to break your routine, remember to do something different, okay? I will try to ask you next class in global politics about if you did something different this weekend. And you please be ready to receive an email in the next 2 minutes to work on the questions that I have and receive the readings, okay? Eid Mubarak, do we still say that right now, or is not really appropriate to say that? Eid, okay, because people having the Ramadan, but I'm not sure if this is the time to say it. So anyways, take care, guys. We'll see you next week, okay?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Samuel. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Ciao, Maria. Ciao, Jamie,
Thank you.
Perkins, and everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you.